Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. A month ahead of the U.S. midterm elections, the Trump administration opened fire at China this Thursday, criticizing China far beyond trade. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence delivered a blistering speech to a conservative audience in Washington. He accused China of meddling in U.S. elections and being militarily aggressive. His points have been firmly refuted by China as an unfounded accusation. Let's take a look.
The U.S. midterm election is around the corner. The vice president's speech is nothing short of an all-out critique on China.
China is meddling in America's democracy. As President Trump said just last week, we have, in his words, found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming midterm elections.
The U.S. Vice President also went after China's actions in the South China Sea and its so-called debt diplomacy in Africa and Asia. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying has called Pence's accusations unwarranted and slandering. She said Pence's speech is nothing but speaking on hearsay evidence, confusing right and wrong, and creating something out of thin air. China unswervingly pursues the path of peaceful development and commits itself to developing friendly and cooperative relations with all other countries. Before Pence's speech, China's ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, said, "As far as China is concerned, we are always ready to cooperate with the United States, even if we have differences. And maybe just because we have differences, the need for cooperation is even bigger." In the face of the upcoming midterm election, the Trump administration has to deal with various domestic challenges, such as the allegation of collusion between Trump's election campaign and Russia, the investigation of a Supreme Court nominee, and the rising trade tension between the U.S. and various economies, including China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. The approval rating for Trump also appears to be declining in a recent survey. Some critics have pointed out that Trump's frequent insults on China are more of a diversion tactic.
For more about the U.S. midterm election, joining us in Beijing, Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. In Washington, D.C., we have Joe Rubin, President of the Washington Strategy Group. Welcome to our program, gentlemen, to both of you. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Rubin, with your political experience serving the earlier administration, how do you understand the rhetoric used by Mr. Pence and earlier by also President Trump, accusing China of so-called meddling in the midterm election? How big is it a political ploy?
Well, certainly this administration has, for now about 2 years, been figuring out its footing on China policy, and we've seen a consistent set of rhetoric and arguments that have been very tough about China. So that's the context. The tariffs recently as well have really ratcheted up the pressure. But this new attack, it needs to have facts behind it. False accusations are harmful if they're false, and if they're correct and true, the evidence should be provided to the American people. And it does raise suspicions here in Washington about whether the Vice President is attempting to distract from the truer story of the Russian meddling in our election 2 years ago, which the intelligence community said did occur. And rather than focusing on that, where there are indications that is still ongoing, now there's a push to move towards China, and so it's raising a lot of questions here in Washington about the objective.
Mr. Rubin, just follow up very briefly. Do you know any concrete evidence shown by the administration or individual administration officials so far that have been suggesting strongly about China's so-called meddling in the midterm election? Has the FBI, the CIA been involved in any of this on the record about the so-called evidence? Is there any?
So there are two frames to think about regarding this. First is the political frame, and the second is the security frame. On the political frame, the administration is feeling the heat of the tariffs policy that it's enacted, where China's response has been targeted towards areas that are supportive of President Trump. So there's political pressure against tariffs in President Trump's backyard, and that makes him feel like there is some influence. But that's different from a security frame where there is direct influence operations, cyber attacks and targeting to sway American voters, potential collaboration with candidates, which is what Russia did in 2016. That evidence related to China we have not yet seen. Perhaps the intelligence community has it, but it hasn't been revealed. And so it leaves us wondering, really, if there's any substance to that, as opposed to the first, where there's significant evidence that, yes, China is putting pressure on President Trump related to tariffs.
I see. Mr. Gao from Beijing, though, one of the things the Chinese are looking at are not only these unfounded accusations, but rather what is really behind these accusations. Mr. Rubin explained from his perspective. What about from the Chinese perspective? Do you see this as an ultimate decision made by the Trump administration and probably overall Washington about future containing of a rising China, no matter what?
Well, at least on the surface, what Vice President Pence said yesterday was very alarming. It's kind of a declaration of hostility and antagonism against China, and it also focused a lot of attention not only on trade, but also in terms of political system of China, in terms of the 40-year reform and economic development of China, and lots of other things, culture included, for example. And this is truly alarming. If it is not managed well, it could really be the first salvo of a Cold War between China and the United States. I personally have never heard a speech like this ever since Nixon's visit to China in 1972. For all these 40 years or so, no senior leader of the United States has ever given a hostile speech as Pence's did.
All right. Another thing about this, Dr. Gao, is some of the things that Vice President Pence said. Of course, we could understand these are political rhetorics, but many of the things is said by a vice president. The other party has to take note. One of the things he said is about China's reform and opening up. And he said this with regards to China's achievements over the past 40 years. He said even, quote, the United States rebuilt China, end of quote. Of course, Mr. Gao, as we understand, over the past 40 years, the Chinese worked head over heels so hard in order to achieve what it has done so far when it comes to economic development and social development. So, Mr. Gao, it sounds at least strange to the Chinese ears, Mr. Gao.
I think Vice President Pence was really indulging in his fantasy. Anyone with the decency of the mind need to come to China to have a look and conclude for him or herself that the great transformation economically in China over the past 4 decades is a direct result of the hard-working Chinese people, working day and night, 7 days a week for many of them, and endless working hours and utilizing all the resources available in China and leveraging off on the stability and the political system here in the country to achieve the transformation. Of course, engaging with the United States helped a great deal. China learned a lot from countries like the United States.
Right, and therefore, Mr. Rubin, what very important quote coming from the Chinese embassy, the Chinese ambassador, Ambassador Cui Tiankai, said to NPR the other day that he, together with China, of course, behind, expect a cooperation, a kind of relationship with the United States, despite of some kinds of competition also existing between the two countries. So it seems that Chinese reactions are quite contained. So, Mr. Rubin, how should we understand now the future logic of Washington? Will it fundamentally harm this very important, the most important, arguably speaking, bilateral relations in the world?
Well, this rhetoric was very alarmist, and it was very unfortunate that the Vice President sought to take credit for China's internal development. There are a lot of lessons here in terms of the way to communicate grievance, but unfortunately what the Vice President did was communicate grievance in a very aggressive way that is a departure. And we could look here in the United States at China purchasing our debt and servicing our economic recovery, too, from a decade ago after the financial collapse, and say that China rebuilt our economy. These are not appropriate ways to engage. But what it is doing is it's signaling that this is the culmination in many ways of multi-years long effort by, in particular, Republican foreign policy thinking of a very hard position now towards China. And there is some evidence to back it up related to cyber attacks, related to economic tradecraft where American technology has been stolen by by China of American companies. There's a lot of concern. But what's happening is it's being packaged in a way that is very hostile, and I'm not really sure what the end game is here. It's almost a sense of we're going to now speak aggressively, rhetorically, and expect you to change unilaterally rather than through more targeted activities and diplomatic engagement. And that's a departure, and it certainly could backfire as easily as get results. And I don't think results are something that we're going to immediately see from this kind of rhetoric.
Before we go for this part, Dr. Gao, is China ready for an uphill battle before the midterm election and probably even after that? Very briefly.
Now, I think we need to watch very carefully as to the result of the midterm election, and also I think we need to prepare for a time beyond Trump. Eventually, whether he stays in the White House for another 2 years or so, or 6 years or so, eventually there will be a new administration that China needs to deal with.
Well, before we talk about the change of the administration, there's already a midterm election coming up in 1 month's time. If we look at the polls right now, some are suggesting good news, others are not necessarily so for the Trump administration. CNN poll released in September found that Trump's approval rating had dropped 36%, and a 6% drop in only a month. The Quinnipiac poll in September also found that 55% of Americans believe Trump is not fit to serve as president, while 41% said he is capable. So we see different numbers. Of course, you will never believe in the polls 100% because they are swaying and at the same time changing leading up to the midterm election. That's why we need to have the wisdom of these gentlemen joining us new on this debate. We have in Washington, D.C. for this discussion also Paulo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute, a public policy research institute that is. In Iowa, we have Timothy Hagel, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Meanwhile, we are still having Victor Gao Zhikai and Joe Rubin with us in this program. I want to ask the two gentlemen joining us new right now. Mr. von Schirach, how should we understand now the two houses, both the Senate and the House of Representatives? There are a lot of debates as to in whose hands eventually the midterm, after the midterm, it will be. Your thought?
Well, indeed, this is really complicated. I think the conventional wisdom here in Washington and maybe beyond is that the fact that there are many seats held by Republicans that are now open seats because the incumbent Republicans in the House have resigned or decided basically not to run again or what have you, for a variety of reasons, that this somehow favors the Democrats, because these are, when you have open seats, you don't have the advantages which are really significant of the incumbent. So that may indeed create an opening for the Democrats in the House. Different story, very, very different in the Senate, because the math does not really favor the Democrats, since the way the this electoral system is comes together. There are many, many more Democratic seats now open for re-election than Republican seats. So the Democrats would have to hold on to all the seats that they have to regain, and then gain a couple. So it's going to be very, very close. No matter, it's very hard to say at this point what's going to happen.
It's very hard to say.
The Democrats
It is very hard to say. Professor Hagel, while we speak, of course, the Senate is trying, at least, to vote on the kind of eventually seat in the Supreme Court, but not result yet. So this is only one of those uphill battles the Trump administration and the Republicans are fighting right now in order to have more political advantage over the other party. Professor Hagel, your assessment briefly.
Well, I would agree with what had been said previously, that with a midterm election, usually the party that's not in the White House will gain seats, and so the Democrats would have seemed to have gained some seats anyway, and as was indicated with the number of retirements on the part of Republicans, it seems pretty clear that Democrats will gain control of the House, but Republicans, again, because of the math, as was indicated, that the Republicans will probably maintain control of the Senate, though it'll still be very, very close. What that would do for Trump's legislative agenda was probably stall it, but he always has the opportunity to work executively in terms of regulations and other sorts of things using his executive power. So we kind of have to wait and see what the ultimate control is going to be and how that's going to affect how Trump is able to advance his agenda.
Well, Mr. Rubin, I understand you're coming originally from the Democratic Party, so therefore you probably have different views of saying and seeing the situation. Mr. Rubin, given the fact also the Trump family itself has been running into one problem after another, tax problem, the fund problem, foundation problem, what would that mean leading up to 30 days from now, the midterm election?
Well, analytically, the interesting thing about these elections is that while the president's poll numbers are important from a national perspective, these are very local races. I myself ran for office once, and for the House race, President Trump is not the primary thought behind voters' choices. They're looking at, from the Democratic perspective, the assumption is that voters are looking at issues like health care and the economy, values and immigration issues. And so those real meat and potatoes issues are going to drive voters. And the real question now in the last 30 days is enthusiasm and turnout. There are 23 seats where Hillary Clinton won more votes that are held by Republicans or are open seats that Democrats believe they should pick up. 23 is the magic number for Democrats to get the majority in the House. But people have to come out and vote. And so voter enthusiasm is the key. In the Senate, I also agree, there are about a half dozen seats that Democrats have. They're very competitive. And this Brett Kavanaugh vote, this is certainly impacting voter enthusiasm today, but 30 days from now is a very long time away. And so we still have time to figure out enthusiasm. But the math is very complicated, certainly much more so in the Senate based upon these trends than in the House for Democrats.
We are seeing the math is being done as the days go by. In the city, in the University of Iowa, I'm sure, Professor, you are having some very different sense of what's going on compared to Washington, D.C. So when the voter turnout issue has been raised by Mr. Rubin, which is always important in the U.S. election, what do you say about that, about people's being divided, and yet would that mean they will be geared up to come out and really vote?
Well, one of the things that we know is that there's always a lower turnout in midterm elections. But Democrats were generally very enthused, unhappy, but enthused and energized about what happened in the 2016 election, and have managed to stay fairly well enthused right up until this point. And of course that's even more the case because of what's going on with Kavanaugh. There was some concern on the part of Republicans that they would not be as energized and so would not tend to turn out. But now, because again the Kavanaugh nominations process has made them energized as well. And that's fine to have the base, both Democrats and Republicans, turn out. But the big question, as it always is what happens to the independents in the middle? Will they be happy with what's going on? As Mr. Rubin indicated, that a lot of this stuff is more or less Washington inside stuff, so the base, Republicans, Democrats that follow this closely, they're going to be energized, but the folks in the middle are caring more about, as he indicated, the meat and potatoes kinds of issues. Economy, health care in particular, seem to be at the top in the polls, and it's hard to say whether those voters are A, going to turn out, and B, if they do turn out, who they're going to vote for.
Well, I only asked you one question. You asked me two questions back, Professor, which is an interesting side. of what is going on in the real election. But let me go to Mr. Von Chirac. The economy is always the economy. They say the economy is stupid. That's coming from the Clinton administration. But is it really the economy? Is the economy doing as well as it looks on paper? If the job rate is really coming up, if the GDP is really increasing, where is the wealth? Many people are asking these days. Will the places of the wealth really put the voters happy about the nature of the growth?
Well, you're making a very good point. Of course, undoubtedly, if you look at the trend, the United States has experienced uninterrupted jobs growth since the beginning of the recovery after the big disaster of 2008. So it started under President Obama. It certainly has continued, and in fact picked up steam. If you look at employment, including the last figures that just came out, another 135 and 145,000 jobs just added to the economy. Unemployment rate at the lowest in 40 years or more.
Yeah.
Economic growth looks like between the 3 to 4% of GDP growth rate, which is really, really good. The question is, as you pointed out, does everybody, in Iowa or Kansas or Montana feel the benefit? Is it really trickling down in the way that we would like to think if there is harmonious growth that touches everybody?
Right.
That's not entirely clear. And again, even though usually the standard wisdom in the past was that the midterm elections are a referendum on how the president manages the economy, Trump is really a divisive leader nationally. Right. And I fully agree that at the local level, especially at the House level, the local issues are dominant. But we cannot really forget that Trump is an entirely new phenomenon in the political history of the United States.
That's right.
And certainly the Democrats want to turn this election on a referendum on him. Whether they'll succeed in this or not remains to be seen.
All right.
But that's definitely part of the strategy.
It is part of the strategy, but will that strategy work? That's the question mark. Another question mark is about this apparent, at least the war of words with China that is going on between the Trump administration and Beijing right now. We understand the trade deficit, Dr. Gao, despite of the so-called sanctions against China, the tariffs against China, the trade deficit actually has been rising rather than decreasing since the Trump administration taken all of these measures. That sounds very ironic, isn't it? But it's not surprising to many of those gentlemen sitting on our panel, because they have pointed out many months ago that tariffs will not work. This is not the time. But Dr. Gao, to China, let's just putting aside the so-called accusation, unfounded, coming from the Trump administration, laugh at it as a joke. But to China, what does this mean, the internal politics that is going on inside Washington?
I think the better way to deal with the trade deficit issue between China and the United States is for China and the United States to make joint efforts so that China and the United States will have a larger trade volume. Now we are talking about $600 billion. We can literally increase that to $1 trillion, for example. And in the additional amount to be added to the bilateral trade, the United States are welcome to export more to China, so eventually we have a more balanced trade between China and the United States. I always believe that's a better strategy, and the current strategy of lumping tariffs on the Chinese export to the United States will not work. Eventually the U.S. economy and the consumers are going to suffer as a consequence.
All right. Before we go, I do want to have Mr. Rubin, since you ran for office once, I'm sure you have a very different version of feelings compared to all of us. From now, leading up to the midterm election, what are the factors that you, as a former candidate for your political office, and as someone coming from the Democrat Party, would love us to watch? And you think that the Democrat Party would watch very closely about the Trump administration and also about the Republican Party, sir?
What you want to be doing for the next month is watching the messaging coming out in the closing period. Right now, Democratic candidates have spent their campaigns trying to build up their name identification and get enthusiasm going and convince voters to a certain extent It's now all about turnout. So what kinds of ads are they going to run? What kind of messages are they going to promote? What kinds of communications to mobilize and turn out the voters, to get the people who they believe are Democrats to come out. The general assumption amongst Democrats is if we get the turnout and we get our people coming out, we will win the House and potentially the Senate. So it's all about motivating the base.
I see. And Professor Hagel, final words from you very briefly.
Again, I would just say that really the turnout of the independents, the people in the middle, decide these kinds of races. The base is going to vote for both sides. They seem energized. Got to get those middle folks out.
At least we got consensus about that. Thank you so much to all of you gentlemen for joining us. Paulo von Schirach, Timothy Hagel, Joe Rubin, and Gao Zhikai. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, gentlemen. Thank you.